Good evening, everyone. My name is Preeti Chopra, and I'm Professor of Visual Studies here at UW-Madison and current chair of the annual conference on South Asia. It is an honor for me to welcome you to this memorial and celebration for our beloved colleague, mentor, and friend, Professor Joseph or Joe Elder. Joe was my cherished senior colleague in the Department of Languages and Cultures of Asia. Everyone, students, staff, and faculty knew that he had a heart of gold and was always ready to help anyone in need. As we gather here at the annual conference on South Asia, it is impossible not to feel Joe Elder's presence and his moral courage during these unprecedented attacks on higher education. This conference, which he helped establish over 5 decades ago, stands as a monument to his vision and to the inherent value in area studies. And we know, institutions like this conference takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, people like Joe to have it, right? To create something like this, which is so monumental, it takes very little time to destroy it. So it is very important for us to hold on to this. Today we have over 1,000 participants at the ACA in person and online, from academia, the public government and industry, all convening to share knowledge and expertise that can assist our leaders in addressing some of the most pressing global issues. Joe understood that the enterprise of area studies could not thrive without community. He believed in building bridges between disciplines, between cultures, and most importantly, between people. Joe Elder was a sociologist by training, but his impact reached far beyond the boundaries of his field. He was a true interdisciplinary thinker, and he encouraged all of us to think broadly, to collaborate generously, and to engage deeply with communities we study. One of Joe's pioneering contributions, among many, was his role in establishing study abroad programs in South Asia. At a time when such initiatives were non-existent, Joe worked tirelessly to create opportunities for students to engage with the languages, histories, and lived realities of South Asian societies in a meaningful way. These programs didn't just change the lives of students, they changed the field. They brought South Asia into sharper focus for generations of scholars and helped foster a more nuanced, empathetic understanding of the region. Joe's legacy is felt profoundly here at UW-Madison. He was a pillar of our community. As a colleague, he was unfailingly supportive, and his work nurturing a South Asian studies community at UW is matched only by his advocacy efforts on and off campus. Today, as we remember Joe, let us also celebrate the values he stood for: intellectual curiosity, cross-cultural understanding, and a deep commitment to peace and justice. Let us carry forward his legacy, not just in our scholarship, but in the way we treat one another, the way we teach, the way we build community. Thank you, Joe, for everything. I would now like to turn to my former colleague and mentor, life mentor, in the Department of Languages and Cultures of Asia, Dr. Charles Hallisey, to share with us some reflections on Joe's legacy as a mentor, collaborator, and moral compass in the academic and global community. Dr. Charles Hallisey is the Yehan Tunumata Senior Lecturer on Buddhist Literatures at Harvard Divinity School and recognized for his scholarship on Theravada Buddhism and Sinhala literary culture. Before joining Harvard, he served as associate professor at UW-Madison, where he was a colleague of Joe Elder in the Department of Languages and Cultures of Asia and the Religious Studies program and the Center of South Asia. Thank you.
So I came to the University of Wisconsin in the year 2000. And before I came, of course, I had heard of Joe Elder. He was already something of a legend in the field of South Asian studies for the kind of institutional work that he had done, establishing the college year in India program, all kinds of other things. Because of people I knew within Quaker circles, I had also heard about him in legendary ways for his work in terms of peace work. Once joining him as a colleague here at Wisconsin, I learned about all kinds of other things that he was doing, helping various kinds of communities that were marginalized, discriminated against here on campus and elsewhere. So when I came and first met him, it felt like I was meeting a legend. But to join a department and have someone as a colleague is to learn about them in a different way, a way that may not be as newsworthy as the legend was, but in the same way, I would say, just as impactful on me or how I understand myself as an academic. And so it was a very quiet kind of example that Joe was always displaying to everyone, that for me was modeling the particular kind of an academic life that I would say was there for the long haul. An example of this was that the Department of Languages and Cultures of Asia was in Van Hise Hall, and Joe's office was in the sociology department in Sewell Hall. So I didn't see him on a regular basis, like I would see people's offices were next to mine. But I would see him when he came for department meetings in Van Hise Hall. Languages and Cultures of Asia was on the 12th floor of Van Hise Hall. And I remember one day when I had taken the elevator up to the 12th floor to go to the department meeting, and Joe came out of the stairway in which he had climbed those 12 flights of stairs. At that time, he was younger than I am now, but he was, I would say, definitely in his late 60s. And it was an example of, you could say, oh, what he was doing was taking care of his health, taking care of himself. But what he was doing was modeling, we're here for the long haul, and choose the harder thing to do rather than choose the easy elevator path. That kind of example of seeing him come out of the staircase, not winded, I would be panting, nothing like that, with a big grin saying, hi. And so that first example, I would say, oh, that is, for me, like symbolizes what Joe was like as a colleague, that he was doing the more difficult in a quiet way and not calling attention to himself. And he didn't show any signs of exhaustion or being out of breath or being weary, discouraged, ever. I don't think it's any secret for people who have been at the University of Wisconsin for a long time that at beginning around the year 2000, for the first decade of the new millennium, the Department of Languages and Cultures of Asia, let me put it this way, we were one rollicking crew. That our faculty meetings were exciting. There were a lot of very heavy-duty intellectual exchanges. We were ambitious. We had an idea that we wanted to establish a different way of doing area studies that would show other programs in area studies what we could be capable of in North American universities. And so it was intellectually exciting. It was also emotionally exhausting because lots of our meetings developed into acrimony and sharp disagreements. And so in that, Joe was always present. But he never participated in the acrimony, but he was always calm, measured, gentle. He models for me. What I would say is that for all of us, he just displayed something that's in Joan Radutra's history of the college year in India that she wrote with Joe. Don't sweat the small stuff. That Joe didn't ever sweat the small stuff. So that when my colleagues had to be compelled to have couples therapy together because of their inability to get along, that Joe just modeled. Sounds serious if that happened, that people were compelled to have couples therapy. Joe modeled that was not necessary. So you could say that his example is working for various kinds of Quaker organizations and peace work. He did it at a large scale, and he also did it at a small scale. The other thing that Joe modeled for me as a colleague, was showing what an exemplary academic life could look like, was to notice the way that he was around students. It wasn't only that he had a certain presence with every student, but it's a sad fact of all university life that inevitably certain students, let's say, fall between the cracks, that they end up doing something in terms of their interests, or things are happening in their personal lives that they are not given the attention that they need or the attention that they deserve by faculty. That just is something that is, unfortunately, all too common in our universities. Almost always, a student that I had a feeling was falling between the cracks. Quite soon, I would see that Joe Elder had stepped up and had taken that person on. The reason why this is so important is that much of the things that happen in the life of particularly a graduate student is that people are discussing them, making decisions about their future, about grants, about progress reports, and so on, and the students are not in the room. So if you're a student who has fallen between the cracks and there's no one there to speak for you, but instead there's only people who say, I have no idea what this person is doing. Can anyone explain? If you don't have anyone there who is speaking for you, this is just a disaster. Again and again, what I saw was that Joe was able to step forward and go beyond what you say was his expertise. And instead of kind of standing on what he was famous for, he just always was responding to the needs, I would say, of particular persons. He was someone who was very, very effective at institutional matters, impressively so. That the way that he was able to steer things through institutional things. But for me, as his colleague, what sticks in my memory was his willingness to step forward to help someone in need when other people were basically just saying, it's not my problem. I have too many other things for me to take care of. And so again and again, seeing that Joe was willing to do that, oftentimes you say, how was he able to do all the things that he did? Someone who now teaches at UW in the Department of Asian Studies, the heir to languages and cultures of Asia, Professor Anthony Cerulli, was not able to be here tonight because of a family commitment, but he just said that what he felt about Joe was that, how does a man do all this stuff? That not only was he totally present and committed to everything happening at the level of individuals at the university, at the level of departments and the school as a whole, not only was he involved in all kinds of peace work and things on behalf of marginalized communities, but also that it was clear that he was a member of a very loving family, and he was a family man as well. And so being able to see that it's possible to be someone who is able to do what a family needs from you, as well as what other people, I just found it exemplary as what a life of an academic could be like. Last thing I just want to mention is that one of the things of just noticing him as a colleague is to see, or to learn about him as a colleague, is to see the reflection of Joe in the impact that he had on other people. One example of this from my time at University of Wisconsin in Languages and Cultures of Asia, that there was someone who was a preceptor in the Sanskrit language, Prabhakara Shastri, who had been a teacher of Sanskrit in Visakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, and then somehow he washed up here in Madison. He was a great resource for students. He was a great resource for faculty, because many of us in the evenings would read Sanskrit text together with him, because he was a traditionally trained pundit. And so just having the example of being able to read with him was like a gift that I never expected to have. But one of the things that Prabhakara Shastri was doing for many, many years that came out of his experience of teaching American Sanskrit, that the kinds of problems that he recognized that they had, that people who knew Indian languages like Hindi didn't have, that he was trying to prepare resources for them that were tailored for Americans. And so he produced a huge, monumental grammar of Sanskrit that was for to target American students who were beginning to study Sanskrit. And the title of it was Jo Elderiya, Lagu Padijata. And it was because there was one time he was having a conversation with Joe Elder and made this observation. Students can't memorize all the things that they need to do because they don't know vocabulary because from their mother tongues or whatever. And that he recognized that this was a problem, and he didn't have any resources to address that problem. And Joe said to him, "You should do something about that." And he did. And so that, to just say, as a colleague of Joe's, I think in a very gentle way, over and over, he was saying to people again and again, when we were venting, when we were complaining, he would just say, "You should," very gently, with a smile, "you should do something about that." And lots of people took that on. So you could just say, like, the impact of Joe goes far beyond all the kind of legendary things that he did himself as an individual, but because of all the other things that he suggested to other people, inspired other people to do. And so he just was a remarkable colleague. I want to close by reading one verse from a medieval singlet poem from the literary culture of Sri Lanka. It was a Buddhist literary culture. But the verse has, I would say, when I thought about how do I feel about my memories of it, having the good fortune of being Joe Elder's colleague, I would say, oh, this verse expresses it particularly well. So, like a wish-granting gem, your sweet way of talking made us happier than we could hope. Seeing you, we figured we must have done something right. Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from Dr. Joan Radricha. Dr. Joan Radricha is an Associate Dean Emerita of International Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She earned her doctorate in Buddhist Studies in the UW Department of South Asian Studies, where Joe Elder served on her committee, and she later served as a lecturer. She conducted research in Pakistan on the Buddhist Gandharan site of Nomogram and its material remains over a period of 30 years. As a longtime colleague of Joe Elder, Joan worked closely with him to build and sustain transformative study abroad programs in South Asia, including the pioneering college year in India program. Today, she shares with us broad reflections on Joe's enduring lecture as a mentor, collaborator, and visionary in international education. Please join me in welcoming Joan Radicha.
Joe was, by any definition, an exceptional person. And my path did cross with Joe for about 50 years, so we did a lot of things together. Joe would sometimes introduce me to people saying, Joan had been my student and she is now my boss. To which I would say, nobody is Joe Elder's boss. Joe made things happen in the midst of roadblocks that would have stymied most people. And he approached the college year programs with the same enthusiasm and positive energy that he brought to so many issues. After observing the first pilot years of the program, Joe wrote an open letter that was delivered to college year students for decades. And this letter began in Joe's words, "Welcome to the undergraduate year in India and overtime Nepal programs. Welcome to one of the toughest, most frustrating years you have ever experienced. Welcome also, I hope, to one of the richest, most meaningful years of your life." A good example of the straightforward, positive approach that Joe took to so many situations. And I think you'll recognize that that's Joe with a little yellow arrow on the head with the 1962-63 group of students. Joe's career in South Asia began serendipitously. He and his wife, Joanne, were to go to China as Shanxi reps, a program of the Oberlin College for some of their bachelor degree students. But political turmoil in China moved their placement to Madurai instead. The time he spent in Madurai at the American College gave him the opportunity to appreciate and reflect on how to respect the culture in which he found himself. Here, Joe, in his lungi, sits with the other teachers. His subsequent research as a Harvard sociology doctoral candidate included living just outside a village. In a tent for which he built the furniture and played holy with his family. And I will say at this time, and I know this is maybe an old-fashioned thing to say, but every great person has a great person behind them. And Joanne Elder, who you see sitting here at a table with her family, 2 children, Joe, during that research year, many of us who associated with the program know and enjoyed the huge vats of rice and dal and vegetable curry that she made that made so many events successful. So I think I wanted to just give a shout out to Joanne as well. Joe was always willing to carry the heavy water, in this photo carrying water from the well near their tent. He went on to carry the heavy water for the college year in programs, being their public face, doing behind-the-scenes work that provided transformational experiences for more than 1,000 undergraduate students. Joe would be the first to let you all know that he did not start the College Year in India program. Henry Hart was a professor of political science about 10 years Joe's senior. Henry developed a concept paper at the UW-Madison that was developing its international focus. He felt that, like the study abroad programs that were being developed in Europe, India should also have a program. So he came up with the idea of sending cohorts of students to India. One reason for such a program, in the era in which area studies was growing in universities in the US, was to create a pool of undergraduates with language and on-the-ground experience in India, some of whom would go on to graduate school and focus on South Asia within their disciplinary studies. They would become area experts who would benefit both the US and India itself in the post-independence years. Joe, a junior faculty member, was asked to visit the 1961-62 group of 5 students as the perhaps inevitable adjustment issues arose. Joe was in India for his own research the following year and met the 1962-63 group upon arrival. And Joe not only dealt with issues that came up throughout that year, but he developed insights and then an action plan for the guidance, information, orientation, and on-the-ground Indian academic programs, the programs when students were actually there, that would make their experiences a success. And there's Joe on the second from the right with the group of students. There was no precedent for groups of U.S. undergraduates spending a summer studying language and then spending a whole academic year in India, earning a full year of academic credit. The experience was so unique, in fact, that the Vice President of India, Dr. Zakir Hussain at the time, met with one of the early group of students. And again, there's Joe on the, I guess, your left side. Okay, over time, the program grew, spanning various locations: Delhi, Varanasi, Hyderabad, Visakhapatnam, also Voltaire, known as Voltaire, Madurai, Tiruvananthapuram for a summer program, and of course, Kathmandu. Joe was involved in every aspect of the program. He developed recruitment flyers that went to colleges and universities around the country. For a period of time, this picture of Dan Enbaum, who's an art historian, some of you may know, was part of that advertisement. The UW College Year program included not only Madison students, but students from across the country. And each of the participants had to be interviewed. Joe interviewed virtually every student. Before electronic meetings were possible, this meant Joe would fly to a hub in several regions of the country and meet with applicants, listening to them make their case for why they would be good program participants. This while carrying his teaching, research, and service load as a faculty member, to say nothing of his community work, such as peacekeeping efforts in South Asia through the Quakers, and a course on nonviolence that he developed at the UW. Joel's dedication to issues was a thread through the various parts of his life. And not because this matters to any of you, but it matters to me. On the right-hand side in the front is a 1971-72 participant in the program who now stands in front of you. Joe figured out that once recruited, students needed a summer of language instruction, a cultural orientation, and preparation for the academic year ahead. Joe built a network of language instructors, on-site staff, Indian and American, who developed learning materials. He conducted meetings and advising sessions that enriched the student experience, to say nothing of organizing ordinary tasks, including immunizations, obtaining visas, and more. As noted, program students came together for the summer preceding the program. In the first 10 years, the summer program moved between various campuses around the country, but after that, it was held at Madison every year. As they studied the language of the region where they would spend their year and participated in weekly orientation meetings, Joe devised opportunities for the students to build camaraderie that would help in the intense, demanding year ahead of them. Though he also noted he observed many lifelong friendships and in some cases marriages that came out of the program. Joe developed creative experiential activities, skits that students performed. Some of the languages, and some of those skits were in the languages that the students had only been studying for a week. It was a way of empowering students to feel they really could do this. Joe's famous role-playing scenarios were so effective that students remembered them long after the program. How a student handled the aftermath to sending the wrong signals to a local shopkeeper. How to deal with requests for funds while being made aware of the differentials in economic means. These were big lessons for 19 and 20-year-olds. More often, students did build a solid support network for the year ahead. though there was one year when the group formed such strong factions that they sawed a communal meal table in two. Joe dealt with this too, and used the experience to inform future groups about the benefits of getting along. Joe saw great potential in students having a whole academic year abroad. Once in India, students studying language participated in a tutorial or university course, and most important, conducted a fieldwork project. These might involve learning a traditional craft, a local profession, a segment of the population, a religious tradition, understanding village life, and more. Joe advised students during the summer as they planned the focus of their project, and when the reality didn't conform to such ideas, Joe remained a sounding board for students throughout the year and during his mid-year visits to strategize, challenge, and encourage each student. Joe was a kind but firm taskmaster, encouraging students to be honest with themselves when an idea did not pan out on the ground, how to open their eyes and see an area of study they couldn't have imagined before living in India. Joe handled many administrative challenges that came up over the years. When the Indian government no longer allowed U.S. faculty directors in India, as had been the case for the first 10 years, Joe persuaded the quite apprehensive UW administration to accept a program model in which graduate students, almost all of whom past participants in the program as on-the-ground leaders of the program, John Grace, in the picture, and I, were the first of more than 60 student monitors who were, in effect, the on-site coordinators of the program. Joe kept in touch with many people, some of whom would become monitors. He helped faculty to develop effective teaching materials that in turn enriched the program. And Joe kept up relations with faculty from the Indian institutions that enriched the student experience through faculty advisors, classes, and letters of admission that supported visa applications. Joe had a way of making everyone feel ownership of the program, and this encouraged the contributions that so many individuals made to the program, even as it changed with the times. Joe spent each winter break not doing his personal work, not spending it all with family, but traveling to South Asia to visit the programs. He met with students and with local staff. He built and maintained strong relationships with local institutions through countless meetings, talks, and cups of tea. And he was open to strategizing about the most complicated and the most mundane issues that rose. Monkeys invading the location where classes were held? No problem. Joe would find the money for the netting, even if it wasn't in the budget. As technology developed and students demanded computers, first to compose their project papers, then to use the internet, email, etc., Joe spent time with staff thinking through how experiences would be changed from communications via airmail letters, telegrams, or long lines for once-a-year trunk calls home to daily emails, etc. But he recognized the need for change and supported local staff efforts to buy the right equipment, understanding that a computer meant rooms properly air-conditioned. Joe kept a long list of publications and professions of former program participants. He took satisfaction in knowing there was a former CY college year student in virtually every U.S. higher education institution with a South Asia focus, and that the program experience led to not only a better informed citizenry, but to many careers, including all levels of education, government service, journalism, filmmaking, environmental and non-governmental agencies, and more. He delighted in hearing about how the program experience bettered our world. Joe always took the time to give students opportunities for memories. Joe and I devised a survey when we were collecting information for the history of the program that we wrote. There's a copy back there if anybody wants to see it. It's also online. It's a digital publication. One student wrote, and I quote, "Many people can look back at their educational experience and identify a teacher or two who really made a difference in their lives. For me, this person was Joe Elder. He did what all great educators do. He recognized potential and was determined to unearth it. He listened patiently to my ill-conceived plan for an arcane paper topic. And he looked at me in a direct manner and asked, 'Is that really what you want to do?' I sighed. What I really want to do is a film." With affectionate mock outrage, Joe said, "Come back here in 2 weeks with a plan for how you were going to get this done." And that student created a really wonderful film called Maya, based on the myth that many of you know. Joe was, in fact, nothing less than the heart and soul of the India and Nepal programs. He was the program's Ganesh, who removed all obstacles, and the Hanuman, known for his strength, writing grants that brought more than $1 million into the program to keep it affordable, his courage in the face of administrative challenges that would have defeated many, and his devotion to the education of students. I think we all miss Joe a great deal.
Next, we are going to hear from Professor Emeritus John E. Court, who is a distinguished scholar of South Asian religions and served on the faculty at Denison University from 1992 to 2020, where he also chaired the department for many years. John's research focuses on the Jain traditions of South Asia and religion, society, and culture and history more broadly in Western India, in particular Gujarat and Rajasthan. As a former student of Joe Elder at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, John brings a uniquely personal perspective to today's reflection, honoring the profound influence Joe had on his academic journey and lifelong engagement with India and South Asian studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Court.
And thank you, everyone, for sort of inviting me to this. It really is a kind of a frightening honor to be speaking about Joe. I'll just say, one friend of mine one time said that he took a course on Buddhism and heard about bodhisattvas and said, "That's not possible," and then he met Joe. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit personal stuff at the end, but I want to say a little bit more about how foundational Joe was to the teaching and study of India over his career. Start with a couple photographs that sort of bounce off of Joan's things. Here's a photograph of Joe and their child Shanti in Madurai in 1952. And then here they are outside the tent. He one time said that the reason why he was hired as a sociologist at Wisconsin was he was the only candidate who had spent 2 years living in a tent. I should also say the reason he was given the place for the tent was it was a mangrove grove in the village that was haunted and nobody else wanted to be there. And then, Joe went on and did a master's in sociology at Oberlin, and then, as Joan said, a PhD in sociology at Harvard, spending 2 years in a village doing a wonderful study of Hinduism and industrialism. Taught for 2 years at Oberlin, and then was brought to Wisconsin, hired by Henry Hart for what was a brand new program in South Asia, or Indian studies then. It became South Asia in 1973, a joint position in sociology and Indian studies. And this was at a time when hardly anybody in the United States had an Indian expertise or knew how to teach about India. So one of the things that Joe was involved in for his first decade was actually the development of curriculum. First thing he developed, and this was sort of a very samizdat published syllabus there, the Civilization of India syllabus, which was designed, detailed lecture by lecture by lecture for a year-long course on Indian civilization that anybody at a university level could teach. He assumed no prior knowledge for these things. And I'll say that somebody who was the first person teaching Asian religions in my department at Denison's a good example of that. He was trained in theology at Yale. He had taught at a little college in Idaho, showed up at Denison to teach theology, and got interested in other things. And actually was one of the first fellows on the AAAS. But he ended up developing courses on India and China and Japan without having been there at first. And these are the kinds of materials that Jim really counted on. And people all over the country used these. So here was, and if you look at the list of contributing editors, authors, sort of everybody who was anybody in mid-60s Indian studies in North America was involved in this. Joe was really able to recruit people. You needed readings, so they came up with these 2 large volumes, got permission to reprint well over 100 different articles for a reader. And this was published in 1966. But, Joe was never content to let things stay as they were. He did a lot of surveys of what had worked with the syllabus, what had not worked with the syllabus, what had worked with the reader, what had not worked with it. So in 1970, he came up with the revised, and I think Joe was actually also responsible for the using the elephant symbol from Magenta, which decades later is now identified with Wisconsin. That was sort of Joe's idea. We used to have T-shirts that had it too. I don't know if you guys still have the T-shirts, but mine have all worn out. But again, so this was an expanded Lectures in Indian Civilization for a year-long course. Even more people on the right that were contributing authors for this. And rather than use the photocopied articles, he commissioned 2 volumes of chapters in Indian civilization. Sorry, this is a little bit fuzzy, but Ancient Civilization with Van Buitenen, Padmanabh Jaini, his first American publication on the Shramana traditions, Gehananda Bharati on pilgrimage, something that nobody had written about at the time, and then Richard Robinson of Madison on Indian philosophy. It was also the volume on British and modern India. The time period's a bit grading now, but that's what was there. Notice that Joe did 2 of those articles, and then a number of other people on dance, development, music, literature, language, and sort of the Republic of India. And again, these were my textbooks in the first India courses I took, and my copies are all marked up and things. So this was 1970, this came out. Well, also as part of Joe's emphasis on education, and actually this was through running the Wisconsin program, one of the students, Michael Camerini, had done a black and white film called Benares, which, if you haven't seen it, it is still a spectacular film. It is wonderful. And, this was his year-long project, and Joe got kind of excited by that and said, wow, films, this is an opportunity. And so this is a list of some of the ones that are available through the center. He got all sorts of grants, hired a bunch of really good filmmakers to make films, some of which, half a century later are still worth showing, and I know people are still teaching with them. Part of what he did was he hired people who'd already been to India, oftentimes program alums. They spent extensive time in India on site doing research, making contacts, and only slowly turning to filming. This is not parachute documentary filmmaking that we see National Geographic do, where somebody comes in for 2 days and does a film and goes away. So part of what's wonderful about these films is they all have got a very deep narrative thread to them that make them really good to teach, because he's telling stories about people. And there were over 3 dozen of these that he did over several different decades, in which Joe was very important in contributing to the field. Was from 1986 to 1994. He was elected as president of American Institute of Indian Studies. And Several of the things he did was he was responsible for computerizing the American operations, sort of like what he did in India. It's like, okay, we need computers to make these things work. AAAS until then had been disdainful of undergraduate educational programs. There really was a divide that AAAS did graduate studies and Wisconsin did undergraduate. When you have Joe, you're going to get both of them. And it really led to AAAS becoming deeply supportive of undergraduate programs. A typical Joe way just said, okay, we're going to do this. A third thing was that, frankly, at that time in the mid-'80s, the AAAS language programs were not all that good. Philip, as a former language head, is nodding his head. Rebecca's nodding her head. And Joe, with all this experience of having language programs through the program, said, we can do better. We can actually be world-class in terms of our language pedagogy rather than what we're doing. And so that was something he empowered a bunch of people in India and the States to develop what is now, really Rebecca's not in her head, she's in charge of the committee, but I think anyone else would say this is a real world-class language training in like 15 or 16 languages you can take now, right? I mean, it's really amazing. The other thing that Joe did, he was there when this happened. He wasn't himself directly responsible for some of the things, but I think in this day and age is an important story to tell. That in the 70s and 80s, 60s, AAAS had been dependent on all sorts of federal grants from dollars, but especially PL 480 rupee funds. That's what ran everything. Well, eventually the United States and India decided that having these PL 480 rupees was not viable for the Indian economy. They would end up giving the monies back to India, what was in the accounts, and it meant that there wasn't this money available for programs. At the time, the Institute had no dollar endowment. We were about to lose all of our rupee funding, and it was a real crisis. And in fact, Joe said that when he took over, Ed Dimmick, his predecessor, the first thing he said was, well, Joe, if we don't solve the financial problems, your job is to close down the Institute. Several things happened. We got access to rupees, we got a dollar endowment, and 50 years later, the Institute is still there. There are crises going on, but I sort of hold on to that as a sense that, we may pull out of this crisis too. And you sort of need Joe's, hope and sort of saying, well, there's a problem, but let's move forward with it. And here's, Joe, that's, Kathy Asher and Purnima Mehta. There he is on the left, and with Daki Saab. Here he is again visiting the library when it was in Benares. And I should say the photograph on the far right was taken 2 years ago here. That's the last time I met Joe. And my wife, Cynthia, who was also a student on the program, Joan said that, the program resulted in a lot of long-term relationships. Anyway, and Joe instantly, he hadn't seen Cynthia in 25 years, instantly recognized her, and he's talking about her undergraduate project on Benares brocades. And how excited he had been to receive it. So, and you've seen some of these other photographs before. Just, a couple things that we're not going to get into, but I think it's worth recognizing all the many facets of this man. Charlie mentioned that he was involved in peace work. Well, he was part of Quaker peace mediation teams. Zero publicity, not much was known about these. That was intentional. That was the Quaker model. But in 65, 66, as a young faculty person, he was part of a team of British and American Quakers trying to mediate India and Pakistan to get the governments talking to each other. In 1969, he made 2 trips to Vietnam to take medical equipment into Hanoi. In 1984, 1985, he was involved in a project to try and mediate the civil war in Sri Lanka. And some of his tales about sort of traveling in jeeps in areas where, he was hoping that the Sri Lankan Air Force wouldn't bomb the jeep. And he was fearless in this. And then finally in 1989, he made a trip to North Korea to try and mediate between the two sides of Korea. This is not something you know about him much, but it's an amazing thing. Something else, Charlie mentioned his work on campus. He was a leader of a movement to censure ROTC on the UW campus in 1989. That was very important. The ROTC was not allowing gay people to join, and he said, that's against our policies at UW. You can't have ROTC here. And he led the faculty movement on that. And he was also one of the founders of the UW LGBTQ plus studies program in 2003. So he was involved in all sorts of things. Finally, just a couple personal memories of him. One is, those of you who, well, we don't have anybody, grad students here, but he gave me my Mahavakya that I sort of said every day as I was working on my dissertation. He said, John, a dissertation is not a book. And I said that every day, and Philip has just been involved in the book to dissertation to book process, but it was really helpful to get away from perfectionism and realize these are different genres and helped me that way. Two things, I should say that, my wife and I were students on the program in 73, 74 in Benares, and then came back to run it as monitors in 79, 81. And so we got to work with Joe. And the program would have folded decades before if it wasn't for him. I mean, he had this attitude that administrations, you tell them what they need to know, and you don't tell them what's going to get them uncomfortable. I said, I can work with this man. But also, at the time, in 79, as Joan said, it was aerograms took 2 weeks if they got through. Usually you had to go to the foreigner registration office to get your mail and say, can I have it now? Telegrams were uneven, telephones were impossible. So how to run a program, and this is part of why the UW administration was deeply suspicious of the program, because it was sort of off on its own. And Joe, I remember the first day I walked in, he said, okay, two things. He said, first of all, I will never, unless it's illegal or genuinely immoral, I will never overturn a decision you make. He says, I'll tell you if I think it's wrong and don't do it again. But he said, if anybody in India, students, staff, get a sense that you are not the final authority, the program will cease to run. That's an amazing trust in a 26-year-old. The other thing he did was he said, you are going to at times need my signature on documents, and we're not going to be able to spend 2 months. So the first thing you need to do is learn how to forge my signature. I could do it. And two other things. One is, Charlie said, people said, how did he do all those things? Well, one way he did it, he never slept. I see a bunch of heads nodding. If you ever stayed there, he was famous that he would go up to his desk in his office at night, and 2 or 3 times at night he'd doze off for 15 or 20 minutes and then just wake up and get back to work. The guy was amazing that way. And I remember when I was doing my master's here, a bunch of us were sitting around the student lounge in Van Nuys, and typical of grad students grumping about how tired and overworked we were and stuff like that. And Joe comes in to get a cup of coffee and overhears this and says, yeah, I know how you feel. He says, I learned that I can't do all-nighters anymore. He says, I learned early in my teaching career that if I was teaching the night before, I had to get 1 hour of sleep. That was not very reassuring to us mortals. But he also was famous for, his little power naps. Anybody who was around him would know that, you'd be in a meeting or something else, and I see some heads nodding, and the eyes would close, and the head would go down. And then about 2 minutes later, he'd snap back into attention, and oftentimes ask a question that had been on something that had been said when he was asleep. I don't know how this guy did it. But I'll say that when I was doing, I did my master's here, and at the oral exam, which was what you did then, he was one of my examiners, and he asked the first question. It was something about higher education in India, and I forget what. And about 2 minutes into my answer, the eyelids close and the head goes down. It was actually very reassuring to me. I said, okay, if the man who asked the question is falling asleep in my answer, I think I'm going to pass. And of course, he woke up, and then we continued the conversation. But the final memory I have of him is anybody who was around Joe. Things happened that just have no rational explanation. And, Joan mentioned that he would come every year and visit all the students, and so he came to Benares for 4 days. I mean, I was exhausted when he left. I was half his age, and I couldn't keep up with this guy. I mean, he would have meetings before breakfast with people, and then breakfast meetings, and on until like 11 o'clock at night. Well, anyway, he was meeting all the students one day in the program house, and finished one meeting, and he said, "What's next, John?" I said, "Well, Joe, we have 1 hour that I wasn't able to schedule on your visit. So I guess, we have an hour. What do we do?" And at that very minute, this guy walks in the door. I've never seen him before. I've never seen him after. It was somebody who was teaching sociology in Balia, which is a 2-hour bus ride north of Benares, who'd been one of Joe's research assistants in Lucknow in the 60s. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I figured that this is about the time of the year when Joe usually comes to India. And I had a couple hours free, so I thought I would take a bus down. And by the way, I have to leave in an hour because I need to get back to Balia." I mean, it was this most amazing event, and they chatted for an hour, and then he got back on the bus and went to Balia. And anyway, if you were around Joe, these things happened all the time. I mean, he really was an amazing person. His ability to trust people, as I said, was, and Joan mentioned, a lot of the students admitted on the program, no other program would admit, and they're now professionals in the field and leading successful lives. He had that confidence that, the program, a year in India, and, it would change people's lives and generally for the better. And I think, that's, as Charlie was saying, it's sort of a model for all of us to follow. We miss him, but, we need to sort of keeping his memory alive and doing what he would do. So thank you for allowing me to share those thoughts.
So given that Joe was a visionary in international studies, it is fitting to conclude our event with remarks by someone who leads us in promoting international scholarship and engagement at UW-Madison today. Consequently, I would like now to invite the Vice Provost and Dean of the International Division, Dr. Fran Vavris, to provide us with some concluding remarks. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fran Vavris.
Thank you very much. And I am really honored to have been invited to attend this tribute to Joe Elder. It has been just inspiring, entertaining, and truly a moment for me as the Dean of the International Division to step back and reflect on some of the reasons why we do what we do at the University of Wisconsin, and my hope that we will be able to continue with our international work, area studies, language programs in the years to come. After watching the slideshow in particular and listening to these stories, I realized we could have an entire conference on the life of Joe Elder. He has clearly made a difference in, thousands of people's lives. I met him 2 years ago. The slide that you had up on the screen, that was the one and only time I met Joe, but I'm so pleased that I did have that opportunity. However, he was, and people have used this word already, he was a legend on this campus. I did my doctoral work here in the 1990s in African studies rather than in South Asian studies, but I would run into other graduate students, and they would be coming from a class with him or coming from an advising session. And so I always wondered, who was this Joe Elder? And clearly I missed a lot by not participating in his programs or taking a class with him. As the Vice Provost and Dean now of the International Division, I've heard many of the same things from his former students and colleagues as reported by this group. I'm especially honored by what he did to establish the college year in India and Nepal programs. We call it now the International Academic Programs Office for the University of Wisconsin is part of the International Division, and our Assistant Dean, Dan Gold, is sitting there in the second row, and I'm sure reflecting on some of Joe's legacies. We would also not have such a strong Center for South Asia on our campus if it were not for not only Joe's vision, but his hard work, and I dare say thwarting people like me to get his way to run this program. And I have to say, I'm glad that he acted first and asked for permission second. His warmth, his intelligence, his energy, and enthusiasm are clearly parts of this legacy that will continue for decades to come. But in addition to the many contributions he made to the University of Wisconsin, there are other people in this room to thank for all that he did. The acknowledgement of his wife, his former students, colleagues, to reflect the deep and wide-ranging influence he had. And I think about it this way: what more could one want than to be remembered so fondly for the lives one has touched and for a legacy that will long endure? At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Joe's work continues to shape students and scholars, and I do hope that we will be able to continue this. But as you know, we are in a critical moment right now in the United States with the termination of all Title VI funding last month. That funding supports national resource centers like the Center for South Asia and the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowships for students to study Urdu and Hindi and many less commonly taught languages. I was the beneficiary of this program. I had a Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship for 3 years for the study of Swahili. I had Fulbright fellowships to do my research in East Africa. So I do feel for all of us at this moment who are trying to determine what we might be able to do without this important source of funding for our work. For those of you who do want to honor Joe's legacy and help us keep South Asian studies strong at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I hope you will consider giving a gift to the Joe Elder Study Abroad Scholarship Fund. This fund will help students to have the transformative international learning and living experiences that Joe championed and that you saw illustrated in the wonderful photos earlier. We want to ensure that his name continues to inspire generations of South Asian studies scholars, not only on this campus, but those who come to Madison from all over the world for intensive language programs in the summer, for the area studies courses that we offer, and also for his inspiration for faculty who might consider leading study abroad programs in the future. I would like to extend my deep appreciation to Joe's children, Shanti, John, and Ed, for sharing the photos today, and acknowledging his sister, Louise, for being with us tonight. My thanks to each of you for sharing your father and your brother with us, and with countless other people who cannot be with us this evening. On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, thank you for being here to celebrate the life of a true teacher whose life lessons are the most important legacy Dr. Joseph Elder leaves behind. Thank you.